The second reading that's assigned to a weekend liturgy is basically independent of the first and the third. It exposes us to a different part of Scripture, and we usually read them for several weeks in a row. Quite often it's one of Paul's letters to a certain community. Last week we finished reading the section from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and this week we start the letter of James, and we will read, including this week, for 5 weeks from this particular letter. James doesn't write a letter to a community, as did Paul. It's simply a letter. And James is not interested so much in teaching doctrine. He doesn't tell us a lot about who Jesus is, or about resurrection, or about salvation. James is much more interested in ethics. How are we to live as followers of Christ? Time and time again, we will hear over these next few weeks, James urging us to put our belief into action. Today he says, just don't be hearers of the word, but be doers of the word. And for James, doing is to taking care of the widows and orphans. And in the time of Jesus, they represented those who were dispossessed, who had no support. If a woman experienced the death of her husband, all the property went back to the husband's family, and she was left with nothing. And while we think orphans always have the support of the community, they did not in Jesus' time. If you didn't have a family, you really had no support system whatsoever. So James opens the door to the possibility, indeed the necessity, of taking care of those who are dispossessed in society. A letter such as James is important for people like you and me, who are in a church, listening to the Word, sharing the Eucharist. Because James tells us that this is incomplete, that this is important, yes, but it's incomplete unless we go forth from here and are of service to another. I've mentioned before the old saying that being in church doesn't make one a Christian, just as being in a garage doesn't make you a car. There's more to it than that. You had to think about that one for a minute, did you? There's also a story told about a grandmother who took her granddaughter to a Quaker service. And in a Quaker service, you don't do much. You just sit there. You might quake a bit. So they're in a circle, and the granddaughter's sitting there. And finally she pokes her grandmother and says, "Gram, when does the service begin?" And the grandmother says, "The service begins when the meeting ends." The service begins when the meeting ends. Because, in a real sense, faith is not a noun, as we would think about it in English grammar. Faith is really a verb. Faith is an action word. Faith is something that we do, positions that we take. After hearing the beginning of the letter of James, perhaps you and I over the next 5 weeks can be more conscious of our need to look out for the widow and orphan of our day, those who are in need of support, either personally or from society itself. In an individual way, we need to be more conscious of how Christ is present in the other. No matter how hard the individual tries to hide the presence of Christ, doesn't really reflect it. But we need to dig deeper and deeper and deeper to see that we need to be doers of the Word. If we do treat others with the dignity and respect that James describes, then we really will hear the Word that has been implanted in us and is able to save our souls.